Nematodes, by common name, oftentimes are called pinworms, hookworms, eelworms, and they get these names from the fact that they are long, filamentous type bodies. They have a head region and a posterior or rear region. They are very, very small, typically requiring microscopes to see. Now, we have different types of nematodes. We have those nematodes which are parasitic to plants. We have those nematodes that are not parasitic, that are going to remain as saprophytes and just feed on dead and decaying organic material. And yet still, although kind of outside of the scope of this class, since we're looking at soils primarily from a standpoint of both agronomic and horticultural application, but another thing we have is we have nematodes which are actually internal or complete part of their life cycle internally inside of host animals and are thought of, for that reason as being parasites on animals. So the nematophyte phylum is a very large one in terms of total number of different organisms. Nematodes are very, very specific types of organisms. A given type of nematode, if it is parasitic to a given species or at least genera of plants, will stay within that very narrow host range. And so for the purpose of our discussion in here, we are going to think of the earthworms as being beneficial and the nematodes as being more detrimental than beneficial in terms of their activity and life and involvement in the soil. Now, the reason we discuss them here is that because they are part of that organic fraction. They are part of that living entity which exists in the soil, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but in the case of the nematodes, their primary effect in terms of horticultural and agronomic effect would be as disease-causing agents or disease-like causing agents in plants. Nematodes are very specialized organisms. Most people that work with nematodes are specialists. And if you suspect that you might be having a nematode problem, then you would need to take a sample of the infected plant material and perhaps even the soil around the root system of the plant and send this in to your local experiment station or land-grant university or could even be a commercial lab for the purpose of getting species identification and verification that is indeed what is causing the problems if you're seeing this effect on crop production. As we progress up even to a higher level in terms of soil animal life, we would encounter the mollusks. Well, you would say, well, what are mollusks? Those are like shell, fish and things like that. But in the soil, of course, those aren't the ones we're talking about. We're talking primarily about snails and slugs. Snails and slugs are in the mollusca phylum. Specifically, they're gastropods. These are primary decomposers of organic material. They live not only on living plant material, but they also feed on dead and decaying organic material, further breaking it down, utilizing some of the nutrients there, but also releasing nutrients in a form much more usable by plants. So I kind of mentioned the mollusca, the snails and slugs in passing. Of course, in a horticulture and or agronomic environment, we think of these as being primarily pests. But we're taking a little bit broader view of these organisms right now in that if they're not living on your host plant, the crop plant, they actually can have some benefit in terms of their effect on breaking down organic material and releasing nutrients in a more usable form for the plants. Also listed on your lecture outline for this course are the arthropods. Well, what are arthropods? It's the Arthropoda phylum. This is a very large phylum. It includes the insects, but it also includes the spiders, mites, ticks. It includes forms of centipedes, millipedes. It includes many forms of animal life that live in the soil. These organisms all play a part in terms of the organic matter cycle. In many cases, the larvae complete much of their life cycle in the soil. They could be detrimental. They could be feeding on roots of crop plants that we're trying to produce. But in many cases, they're kind of innocuous, meaning that they are there, they exist, they feed on organic material, they break it down, they utilize energy and nutrients from it, but they in themselves living in the soil are going to die at some point in time and be broken down, and the nutrients that they once took in are now going to be released. So they all play an important role, all of these animals that exist in the soil, at least during part of their life cycle. And finally, at the top of the soil animals are the vertebrates. Vertebrate animals obviously are from an evolutionary standpoint, are higher than would be the arthropods, the mollusca, etc. Why? Because the vertebrates have an internal skeletal system. They have an internal skeletal system. What's an example of a vertebrate animal that exists or lives in the soil? We have many different types of rodents. We have gophers, we have moles, we have voles. These are some of the ones that come to my mind right now, but they are inhabiting the soil, they're burrowing through the soil, they're feeding on live plant material, they're feeding in some cases on dead and decaying organic material. The biggest effect of these is going to be not only the effect they have on plants that are growing there, but also the effect they have on mixing of organic materials in the soil, creating channels, burrows, and these types of things, which have an effect upon aeration, water movement. The net effect of having them there, if you're trying to produce a crop, is definitely a detrimental one. If it is not a crop situation, the net effect of having them there may actually be beneficial because of the burrowing activity, the mixing of the soil, the breakdown of the organic material, and the overall increased aeration and water movement that exists in soils. But I would think that most people involved in production agriculture would agree that gophers, moles, other forms of rodents which inhabit the soil and live there are going to be more detrimental than beneficial. I simply mention them here because they are kind of at the top of the soil animals which do exist in the soil, and at some point in time they're going to become part of that organic material as they die and their bodies are decomposed by these lower forms of plant and or animal life which exist in the soil. We will next discuss the interaction of these microfauna, microflora. I didn't use those terms yet, but flora, of course, are the different forms of plant life, and the fauna are the different forms of animal life which exist in this organic fraction of the soil. I've included in your packet a copy of an article that I took from a Agrochemical Age magazine, and I'd like you to read this because it does a very good job of explaining the role of these various organisms, which are primary, which are secondary decomposers, and the interrelationship of these to each other. Also included after this article, which I've copied out of a magazine, are a couple of other pages which have been taken from various textbooks. And